Hello, and welcome to our brand new YouTube series, In Conversation With. I'm Eva Bishop, and I am Communications Director for the climate and nature charity Beaver Trust.
And I'm Sophie Pavelle, and I coordinate communications with Eva.
We are also climate activists, and in this special series to acknowledge COP26, we're letting you be a fly on the wall on a chat between two inspirational figures about some of the key topics at COP26.
Yes, this is going to be great fun. Bite-sized snippets of insight that won't take up too much of your time, but may well resonate with you. We want this to be something that you can fit easily into your day, but enough to give you some serious food for thought around all that hustle and noise at COP26.
So in this series, we and colleagues will be in conversation with experts on each of the 4 sustainability goals for this landmark conference, from biodiversity to finance to collaborating on a greener future. We've got some fascinating conversations lined up for you here.
So without further ado, welcome to this conversation. Ben Macdonald, hello. Long time no see.
Hi Sophie, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you? Good. I thought I actually got out my very special Arctic Tern mug just for you. Thought you'd appreciate that.
Oh wow. Okay, well I can keep it company with some seabirds.
You've got that one. Oh,
yeah,
good one.
But their goals, though, I think terns are slightly better. But personal
more
judgment.
High end, yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Boutique.
Okay, so COP26. This video is going out obviously right in the midst of the conference, and as we know, this series is exploring the dialogue around the 4 sustainability goals that COP has set out for its very ambitious 26th global conference. And the one that I wanted to chat to you about today was number 2, and that is adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. And the copy that COP26 has on their website for this goal is: the climate is already changing, and it will continue to change even as we reduce emissions with devastating effects. At COP26, we need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build defences, warning systems, and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods, and even lives. Big stuff. Pretty ambitious.
Well, necessary. I mean, the more degraded the landscape, the more ambitious you need to be. If you're in eastern Poland or Romania or Belarus, where you have quite intact natural systems, all you have to do is protect them. We don't have any intact natural systems left at scale, so we have to put them back from scratch. And in order to do that, we need the land on which to restore those systems. And therefore, there is a heated debate going on at the moment, as we all know in the UK, about how we use our land in the future and how we use that land to protect communities. And I don't just mean protect industrial farming or sheep, I mean protect whole communities, protect villages, protect the rural way of life. Future generations, allow farmers to continue farming. And that comes down to protecting our soil. That comes down to protecting our hillsides, which are generally speaking devoid of trees when they should generally speaking be highly wooded, restoring keystone species like beavers at scale, keeping water on the land, letting it run off more slowly in the winter months. So we know what needs doing, or many of us know what needs doing. The real question is how we do it.
Big question. And in terms, maybe let's wind it back. What are we needing to adapt for exactly? I mean, you've done such an immense amount of research for your books. And is this adaptation and boosting resilience more of a concept, or is it an urgent reality that we need to start thinking about?
Well, every year people in Britain die because there aren't enough trees on the hills. So I would describe that as fairly urgent, mainly because it is entirely avoidable. If you go to what I would call a more responsibly farmed country, Hungary, for example, you have a great amount of productive farmland in the lowlands, and you have some non-intensive farmland in the hills, you free roaming cattle, wood pasture farmland, But what you don't have is the denuded hillside. We've all been for walks in the Brecon Beacons, and we've all commented what a long way. We can see those sort of lovely smooth hillsides completely devoid of any vegetation nuance. Well, of course, that's simply the product of deforestation, often centuries ago, and then that deforestation being sustained by sheep grazing predominantly. But of course, you are still left with the problem that those hillsides, and the hillsides are vast in their acreage, are catapulting water down into valleys. Those valleys are obviously there's no viable beaver populations in Wales, so there are no natural agencies stopping that water catapulting down, flooding the Wye, flooding the Severn, flooding people's homes. So at the very least, you're talking about millions and millions of pounds of avoidable financial damage to everybody in the rural community. And at its worst, especially in places like Cornwall, where you've got particularly steep valleys, all of which would historically have been wooded, you're talking about the loss of life. So it's not a concept. It needs doing urgently. And, we're beginning to see individual thought leaders, people like James Rebax, who've realised this and are re-scrubbing the hills and putting layers of trees in the Lake District. But, the reason we single out people like James is because then they may not be the exception to the rule, but they are the conspicuous minority. We're not seeing that happening at the 100-kilometre level in Wales and Western England in particular. I'm singling out Wales and Western England because that's where the topography leads to the most serious flooding. But of course, that happens for different reasons on the Somerset levels, with the drained rivers silting up and flooding farmland of people's houses on the Somerset levels as well. So we have a major flooding problem in the UK, and it's a major problem because we are a rainforest country. We are a wet country. We're not talking about flooding problems in Saudi Arabia or wherever. We're talking about flooding problems here because we have the climate that is wet, but we don't have the environment to protect against the climate. So the need for planting trees, or I would much prefer not to plant any trees, the need for natural regeneration, in my view, is absolutely urgent, and we need to start now.
I completely agree. And I mean, you talk about flooding, but obviously drought is a big problem as well, and wildfires, and that's growing, and that's only going to continue to grow. I was in the Wiltshire Chalk Stream area yesterday doing some work, and the guy I was speaking to said that area they're terrified because they're long overdue a really, really serious drought, and chalk streams are naturally very shallow and they're not fed by the headwaters as rivers in Devon are. And so flooding and drought are two enormous, intense events. I mean, Chris Jones and any farmer, if you ask them what scares them the most, they're starting to say drought does. And lack of water.
Well, it's a fine line. For farmers, it's probably drought. For rural society at large, because we do have piped water, drought, increasingly is a problem, but flooding is an existent problem. I mean, it's a 50-50, a 60-40. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that the most staunch advocates of restoring beavers are not, as the Countryside Alliance would have it, this kind of urban intelligentsia. These are farmers who are realising that beavers can keep water on the land in summer. And there's nothing to prevent you nicking water from a beaver pond. There's nothing to prevent a beaver pond acting
to siphon it.
As an aquifer for our upland farming communities in the future. All they need to do, as we know, is allow 10 metres either side of a river, and they get a free aquifer in summer, and they protect their communities against flooding in the winter months. So it is obvious to me, as someone who understands how these animals work, that it is a no-brainer. But it does require ceding some land to animals, to wild animals, like beavers, and that has become a very alien concept. It's not an alien concept in Poland, Belarus, or Estonia, where you've got 20,000 beavers plus. You've even got beavers in the middle of Berlin in Germany. They're just an accepted animal that 90% of the time engineers rivers to the good of society, and 10% of the time, yes, they're a problem, and they could be translocated and they could be moved. This war between sort of beavers and rural communities. Beavers can help rural communities. It's our job to make sure that farmers in particular understand that beavers are the aquifer solution to the drought problem. Now, the drought problem will be far more severe in the years to come in eastern and southern England, because those are our driest areas. So it's not just getting beavers back in the West Country, which, as we know, is already underway. It's getting them back into East Anglia, into Kent, into Sussex, into the home counties, because that's where arable farmers are going to be facing droughts. I think beavers are viable solutions for farming, but of course they serve wider society. A relatively small proportion of our rural community, believe it or not, are farmers. They're teachers, they're vets, they're ordinary people living in the countryside whose houses are being affected by flooding. And we need to see, afforestation of our hills, and we need animals, of which really there's only one, the beaver, that can prevent high-speed flooding of straight rivers. But of course, you've got to remember that our rivers have been so straitjacketed that it's not as if a beaver's a magical tool that will turn up and wiggle a whole river in a year, which is why, unwinding these rivers, or re-wiggling, as James Rebanks calls it, is really important. Because sometimes if we have canalized a river, there's nothing a beaver can do about it. That's going to need human ingenuity to re-wiggle that river, to put the meanders back in, so you're slowing down the water. Just like if you've got a motorway that's straight, everyone puts their foot down and drives faster. And if you've generally got a winding road, sensible people anywhere drive more slowly. And the analogy holds for a river system. The more meandering it is, the more chance there is of, if there is a flood, it's a slow expansion of water onto adjacent land. It's not that catastrophic sudden event that floods people's homes.
I think also a lot of it is about adapting, not physically, but adapting our mindsets to be ready for these changes, because the beaver debate is old now. Whether beavers should come back or not is old news, because they're here and they're going to disperse and they're going to be in more and more rivers over the coming years. It's the question of, are we ready for not only having the second largest rodent in the world back in our rivers, but also all of the other changes to come? Are we ready for climate change? Are we acting fast enough to protect not only the landscape and its nature, but also, as you said earlier, the cultural heritage and the knowledge of communities in not just rural areas, but in other economies as well? And, these are such big things. I can't help but feel that most people don't have land that they can make positive decisions for nature. So what can the average person living in a terraced house in a city do to help feel that they're either adapting their mindsets for nature or doing their bit for their community and local wild space to help boost its resilience to climate change?
I think it depends where that community is. I mean, for example, what we're seeing in the Yorkshire moors at the moment is a lot of small communities have suddenly realised, or realised with more clarity, that the cause of flooding in their villages is not water. It's the fact that the moors above them are being burnt and bereft of trees, and therefore those moors are effectively intensive grouse moors are catapulting water down into their villages, and they're beginning to talk to local MPs and councillors about the fact that, and water companies who own a lot of this land, that this is a problem, and this is an entirely avoidable problem. It's not as if those hills aren't even being farmed except for grouse. And so I think, community action, I'm not necessarily talking flag waving and protest, I'm talking lobbying at the local level, speaking to your MP about whether something is actually financially viable. It's the same on the Somerset levels. We're seeing maize fields, as we know, contribute massively to soil runoff and soil degradation, filling up rivers that then flood. But they don't just flood farmland, they flood everybody. So I do think local communities are beginning to wake up to the fact that a lot of what they've accepted as being kind of integral to the landscape, the sheep farmed hillside or the grouse moor, are actually harming their rural environment and their chances of a future. And a lot of younger farmers are waking up to the fact that if they don't have any soil viability, they can't farm into the future, let alone hand it down to their children. So we're seeing a big resurgence in local level regenerative farming, soil protection, keeping soil covered, the essence of farming. So I think it's already happening. I think the question about what to do in an urban environment is in some ways more challenging, because if you live in the centre of London, you are highly unlikely to be aware, unless you're reading about these things or engaging with these issues, that the majority of Britain that isn't built upon, which is 94% of Britain, is in a terrible way. That the countryside is largely one or other type of factory. It's not this beautiful living, breathing thing that you sort of see in all of the sort of the park brochures and the sort of on Countryfile. So I think it's very hard for people in cities, or can be hard, to understand the level of environmental degradation in the countryside. Because if you live in a city and you get to the countryside, it's clean air, you've got lovely views, everything's green. That feels like a relief.
So yeah.
But if you actually understand the countryside, and especially if, like me, you've travelled to countries where the countryside is still loud with, bees, yellowhammers, redback shrikes, wrynecks, corncrakes, you name it. And you come back to Britain, you go, oh, this is a desert. But it's not a widely held view, because I don't think it's an easy thing to understand. And also, I think there's a lot of it people don't want to understand. Nobody who cares about this country or is very, I wouldn't say patriotic, but proud to live in this country like me, nobody wants to be saying that the hills are denuded, the farmland is silent, that the moors are monocultures for grouse. We'd much prefer that wasn't the case, and that we didn't have to be having these conversations at all. But it's very, I mean, going back a few generations, my father's family are from the Macdonalds of Skye, and my mother's family descend from
I didn't know that.
potato farmers in Pembrokeshire. So it doesn't give me any pleasure that if we continue to use the land in this way, it's not just that there won't be a future for turtle doves or redback shrikes or skylarks, it's that there won't be a future for farmers. So it's not about attacking the farming community, it's about offering them a future. I think the greatest individual contribution can be challenging governments, and we do that via our MPs and the democratic process, on what are we paying for. I want to pay for the countryside. I want to pay for very extensive ivermectin-free organic farming. I want to pay for us growing more oats. I want to pay for us growing more orchards. I would pay an orchard subsidy from my taxes tomorrow, because orchards grow pears, apples, cherries. They produce cider, they produce wood, they produce charcoal. You can graze animals within an orchard. 4 centuries ago, we had more sustainable farming methods. The whole of Herefordshire was covered in an orchard. We have this extraordinary tradition of being able to be productive, but the great myth is that we are productive, and actually we waste the countryside at a truly epic scale. 8% of Britain is deer estate. Another 8% of Britain is grouse moor. So that's 16% of Britain producing 0% of our food. And then you've got vast marginal areas of farmland that wouldn't exist were it not for public subsidy. So when people always say to me, well, who are you to say? I'm like, well, I'm the person funding it. So I have but I want to see more farmers on the land. I want to see less intensive practices. And for that to happen, I want to see sustainable land. Now, I think we have to realise when we talk about rewilding, or I prefer the term restoration, ecosystem restoration, because it's just an easier term to understand, I think, is that it does work on a spectrum. It's not an absolute. It's not you either have wolves and lynx or you have nothing. I mean, that's ridiculous. We have to be pragmatic. So if you go to Eastern Europe, you don't just see wild areas and intensively farmed areas. There's a spectrum, but the difference is what that spectrum is. So the national parks are actual national parks. They are protecting the original ecosystems of that country. They're monetized through accommodation, ecotourism, cycling. There's a lot of income coming into those rural communities. Then you've got areas of low productivity farmland, but rather than a denuded hillside being eaten away by sheep, we're talking cattle roaming through wood pasture landscapes. Now, those aren't truly natural. Those are farmed. They may contain orchards, fields, any number of configurations, but they are buzzing with life. And then you have your high intensity productivity farmland, your arable, your bigger fields, your mechanized farming. Nobody's suggesting that we need to get rid of the productive farming. What we need to do is challenge waste, because we do waste land on a huge scale. And remember, a very steep hillside in Wales is not supposed to be a farmed habitat. Even by farming's own definitions, most of Wales is regarded as unfavourable land. Now, I'm not saying that means you just stop farming all of it, but you need to think about what you're doing with that land. And if those hills are treeless, the consequences for everybody, not just farmers, is severe. So that topography is not suited to grazing animals, except of course sheep, which are adapted to these very steep slopes where they originate from. So I think we need to be really careful in remembering that we, the taxpayer, are paying for, at the moment, environmental degradation. I would rather pay farmers more to do something better. We can invent something better. Now, we're seeing elms at the moment. We're seeing this idea of public money for public goods. That is exciting. It's also incredibly vague. We need to think about what that actually means. And we need to look at specific landscapes. But you can't just waffle about the generalities of trees, water. It's too nebulous. You need to look at it a national park at a time, a county at a time, and say, well, what are the major problems of resilience? The main one is almost always the fact that steep slopes, which are designed to be heavily wooded, oak, hornbeam, lime, rowan, are completely devoid of trees. So they must be naturally regenerated, and therefore livestock must be taken off. And therefore you must either pay farmers to do that, or if they are looking for a way out, you can pay them to stop, or both. But we can't continue to pay for ever so slightly less livestock on a steep hillside, because you are going to have the same problem of people's homes flooding in the future. So I think we need to pay for better outcomes, but we, the public, all need to be more informed about what we want to be paying for. Because at the moment, I think people think that all the farmer they pay for feeds them and ends up on their plate.
Well, and that's what we get taught at school. We get taught that the farmer is farming our food and it ends up on our plate. We didn't once get taught about supply chains and where our food actually comes from in the UK. We get taught the almost idealised, oh, isn't it lovely? The farmer farms the field and picks the carrots, and then they're washed, and then they're processed, and then, they end up in Sainsbury's.
I've seen that though, and I've seen it in many countries. I've seen it in Alaska, in Eastern Europe, and I've even seen it in southern France and Germany, where farming is feeding at the 10 to 50 kilometre level. So in other words, it really is local produce. It's not the myth of local produce, it really is. And it's sustainable produce.
And it's normalised. It's probably not like, in the supermarkets, they sort of glorify when it's British chicken or British carrots or carrots made here. And it's like, oh, that's exciting. It should be normalised.
And this is a huge difference between, say, Spanish farmland and British farm, is cattle are a native species in the British Isles. So if you use them cleverly, move them around the landscape through clearings, move them through woodland, you don't even need to keep cattle in the fields.
Rotational grazing as well.
Rotational grazing. Then you're actually beginning to mimic at least some of the ecosystem functions of the original aurochs and the tarpan in a farmed environment. So you have piggy disturbance, you have soil motivation, you have a little bit of woodland disturbance by cattle. Fantastic. They get rid of the excess bramble, create more of the mosaic habitat, more glades. So it's possible to integrate elements of rewilding into the farmed environment. But what we're not talking is just a few less cows in a pen field. We're talking animals interacting with scrub, with woodland. And I've seen it in enough countries. When you see it, you just go, oh yeah, they're in a field, but it's not a field. It's a woodland-studded meadow with wrynecks, redback shrikes, turtle doves, and nightingales. But you go to Spain every night in the restaurants, they're the most fantastic steaks, but you know that they've come off these tree-studded hillsides, home to eagles, vultures, and even wolves. And even then, you go, this is still a farmed ecosystem. So I've been talking to a lot of a lot of farmers and landowners about what I call the Spanish Hills model, which is it doesn't have to be this pea green field with 4 walls or hedges or no animals. It can be a woodland studded landscape with animals, with higher quality meat, a better story, viability for the future, no soil runoff, and you can still farm it. And I think the biggest problem with farming is farmers never have the time to go to other countries. So I'm telling them all this stuff, and they don't not believe me. But what I'm trying to do next year is actually round up some regen farmers and some future-thinking farmers and take them to these places, because then it stops sounding like a sort of pipe dream that's been connived to sort of subtly get farmers off the land. And you can say, look, this is working. This is the yields. These are the number of animals, horned cattle, pigs, some sheep, this is what the environment looks like. Have a listen and just think about whether you want that. But I also think it's not enough for us to say farmers need to choose. Farmers don't have a choice. We are paying them, or have been paying them, to do awful things to the environment. Many of them have pushed, but ultimately had to get rid of their orchards, had to get rid of their pigs. I know farmers who had to stop keeping outdoor pigs. I mean, how ludicrous is that? If we pay for different outcomes, we make life easier for farmers. You will still see some who really just don't get it and will trash the place. But you'll see a lot of others on the fence line who will come to the side of helping us regenerate the land. But we have to pay them to do the right thing. And I think that lies at the heart of regaining adaptation, environmental stability.
I completely agree. A very wise friend of mine once said that we're asking farmers to do one thing, but we're paying them to do another. So it's all talk, and yet the fundamental financial incentive does not change. And so with what you've just said, my final question to end this chat on was going to be, what is Benedict Macdonald's vision for Britain in the next 10 years? You can have an idealistic one, and then maybe what do you really think?
Well, I prefer to have a very ambitious one that I think is practically achievable, which I think is a 3-tier model. I think we need to stop pretending that our national parks are wild, and we need to rewild them. Our deer estates, our grouse moors, the Cairngorms National Park, they shouldn't just be farming grouse or one species of deer. These should be our Yellowstones. They're not farmed, they're just misused. Then you've got areas like the Lake District, where there's this extraordinary cultural heritage of farming. And I don't believe that it's for people like me to come in and suggest that we wipe that out, nor would I want to. But I do think that can go to what I would call the Spanish Hills model. In other words, what the Lake District looked like 200 years ago, it was still a productively farmed environment of small fields, but it was input-free. It was, by default, it was organic. The animals were roaming the hillsides in much smaller numbers. There was much more of an emphasis on cattle and less of an emphasis on sheep. And all of those things lead to more resilient hillsides, wooded hillsides, and some natural regeneration. You don't need an absolute canopy woodland to stop a village flooding in the Lake District. You need scrub, you need trees, you need complexity, and you need beavers. Now, I would love to see places like the Lake District transform from that sort of smooth, brown hillside landscape to a tree-studded landscape. I wouldn't want to see farming taken off, because I don't think it needs to be. And then finally, we have to produce our food and not create myths that we're producing our food in areas where we're not. We have to produce large quantities of food. However, again, drawing on experiences from places like Hungary, we can still afford not 1 metre margins, but 10 metre margins around arable fields. I've walked around intensive barley fields in Hungary, home to breeding great bustards, and the margins have contained 50, 60 cuckoos, turtle doves, because 10 metre buffers deliver an entire grassland along the edge. And we need to really think about glyphosate. We need to really think about neonicotinoids, pesticides. I'm not saying we should never use them, but the amount of spraying in our countryside is shocking. We could be having organic moratoriums by the 10-kilometre level. So every 2 years, a 10-kilometre of Britain has to go organic. Then so that farmer doesn't get, it doesn't get completely shafted if they're growing just one particular crop that's very susceptible to pests. You can lift the moratorium, but by that stage, the invertebrate populations have recovered. They then move into the next 2 kilometres. So I think at every scale, we can be optimising productive farmland, low-intensity grazed farmland, and then what we don't have, which are wild ecosystems that are driven by ecotourism and by natural capital at scale, the Cairngorms, Knoydart, all of these places that are just empty. And they're not just empty of wildlife, they're empty of jobs, they're empty of people.
This is the thing that I think people forget, is that nature restoration will create jobs and it will make money. It's again adapting our mindset to seeing nature as seeing natural capital. I'm not a fan of adding a value, of putting a price tag on services that nature provides for us, because I think that that's counterproductive. But viewing nature restoration as something that will boost our economy is something that we seriously need to just act on.
It's funny you mention that, because I, in the last few weeks, have joined a company called Real Wild Estates. I'm their head of nature restoration, and we work in naturenomics. We map out for farmers and estate owners why ecological restoration can make them more money than what they're doing at the moment.
Yeah,
and that is important. People's livelihoods.
It's the first question people ask is, what's in it for me?
Yeah. But it's okay to ask what's in it for you, because you're not just thinking of you, you're thinking of your parents, you're thinking of your children, you're thinking of your wife, your husband, whoever. It's a very valid question to ask. And I think the nature lobby have been shockingly bad in the past at answering it. We said, oh no, we don't want you to make money, we want you to do this because it's right. And a lot of people sit down and go, well, I'd love more skylarks, but skylarks aren't making me money. Potatoes are making me money, or corn is making me money, or whatever. But actually, when you break down and you take away subsidy and you look at a future where farmers or larger landowners could actually live off the land and make a profit, diversified revenue streams provided by ecosystem restoration are economically far more viable than subsidised farmland, which means that even if a future government take a subsidy away, with our model, you can still make money from the land because you are diversifying your yield. Now, that doesn't mean not farming. That means taking yield off the land, venison, wild meat, beef, farming a part of the land. It means natural capital payments, carbon payments, forestation grants, accommodation, ecotourism, all of the above. Aggregate. Everyone knows if you're an investor, how do you safely make money in today's society? You diversify your investment
portfolio. Yeah.
If you are entirely dependent upon sheep, you are inviting a future that your children cannot be a part of.
Yeah.
They cannot be a part of it. It's 80% subsidised in parts of Wales. So there isn't a future there. It's a museum life. What I'm interested in is a real future for rural people, including farmers, including gamekeepers who we're talking to about adopting new management practices on estates in Scotland, and creating more jobs that don't exist at all at the moment, like rangers and guides, because there isn't anything to see. So I passionately believe in ecological restoration and jobs creation go hand in hand. But you've got to do the ecosystem restoration properly, or you never get jobs.
Yeah, it's like how doctors advise us to take a holistic approach nowadays to enhancing our immune system and increasing the resilience of that. If you just take vitamin C every morning, that's not really going to do much. But it's, implementing all these different things, getting good sleep, getting exercise, eating well, maybe taking supplements throughout the winter or whatever, drinking a lot of water. All those things are going to, increase your immunity to all sorts of different things. It's the same approach that we need to take, like the Swiss cheese model, I think it's called.
Well, indeed. When I talk to the most enlightened farmers and people like James Rebanks, they have this real understanding. You need to protect the soil. You need to protect water. You need to protect from flooding and from drought.
Yeah.
You need to reforest as much as you can within that landscape. and you need to create more scruffiness and more wildness. And that's something all farmers could do if we paid them to do it. Now, some will do it out of the goodness of their heart. Others are rich enough that they can afford to take the risks of allowing marginal land
the risk,
to scrub up.
Yeah.
But we as a society need to take the risk off them. And there are two ways of doing that. New state subsidies, but on the larger estates and the larger farms where I'm mainly working at the moment, you can live a subsidy-free lifestyle off the land, but you have to diversify. You cannot do that through any method of farming that the NFU would recognise or recommend. You have to go back to the best of the old, the best of the new, and you have to combine it. But I believe that if we do that, that a future where the environment protects us is entirely achievable within the next 10 years.
Well, what a lot of food for thought. Thank you. That's very
Thanks, Sophie. No, pleasure. Lovely
and
to
aren't
talk
we
to
lucky?
you.
Yeah, and Ian, aren't we lucky to have someone like you actually working on the ground, doing the good stuff and having those conversations and applying that pressure? It's really cool.